Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody who is watching this live and those that are watching the recording afterwards. Welcome to our Office of the CTO Roundtable on Microsoft Build, what IT leaders should know to do next. So my name is Tom Lilly. I'm Field CTO for Cloud Solutions here in the Netrix Office of the CTO, joined by two of my colleagues, my esteemed colleagues, if I may be so bold, Mr. Mike Lutenberger, who is our Field CTO for Artificial Intelligence, and Mr. Shean McManus, who is our Field CTO for App Modernization and Data Platforms. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being with me today, and being with us today, I should say. So really, we wanted to get this roundtable together because as we're talking to our customers, Microsoft is making a lot of changes to how they approach AI and some of the solutions and some of the services that they're putting out across both Microsoft 365 and Azure, obviously being their two primary cloud platforms. At the time of this webinar, Build was about 2 weeks ago or so, and there were a lot of announcements, and some of those announcements have some very broad and very deep ramifications on how our customers are approaching AI and how we think AI is going to look in the future. So what we wanted to do is get together and start having some discussions and sort of talk about some of the things that we heard during Build that we think are very important for others to know, and that may shape how you approach AI in the future. And with that, obviously, there's other things other than AI we may cover on, but that's going to be the primary topic. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to kick us off, because as our Field CTO for AI, he's knee deep in all this stuff, and there was a lot that came out. So Mike, where do you want to start? What do you think is most important here?
Sure, let's talk. I think we're talking about Scout, right? So that was, in my opinion, one of the big announcements, because there's a whole lot going on with Scout. So what is Scout? So Scout is part of what Microsoft is calling part of its autopilots. Now, what does autopilot mean? And mind you, this is the only autopilot at the time, right? Currently, but the idea is that there will be more autopilots later, right? And again, I'm sure a lot of that will see how this one's being used and kind of where that can fit. But the idea or characteristics, however you want to look at that, is kind of an autopilot and copilot is it's something that's always on, right? So it's not copilot, and we'll kind of talk about the difference in that. So again, Copilot's going to ask for you to prompt it, and then it's going to go do a thing, right? Whatever the thing that you're asking it for. This is not that. This is something that's always on. Think of it almost like a listener, right? It's not waiting for a prompt to happen, right? It's persistent in the background. One of the things, again, I don't want to get too deep into this because we talked about it, and I'm not sure this was necessarily a build conversation, but this will definitely feed into the idea of Agent 365, because one, the autopilots will get their own Entra ID, right? So they're going to be like a user, if you will, in the environment. So all the things you can think about from a user perspective, from purview and whatnot, are all going to kind of apply here, right? From a security and kind of management perspective within that. So, and then one we'll talk about in a second where autopilots come in is work IQ. There's a work IQ layer. I'll talk about that right after this. Again, all of these kind of pile on top of each other. And then again, it can also act on behalf of, right, whether it's a department, a thing, a user, whatever. So that's kind of what an autopilot does. But specifically with Scout, again, it integrates across teams and Outlook and OneDrive and SharePoint, right? It's connecting essentially your chats and your email, calendar, contacts, all that fun stuff together. It's built off of OpenClaw, right? So again, I'm sure everybody's familiar with whether you've heard some amazing things with OpenClaw or some frightening things with that. Again, you can rest assured that Microsoft is making sure that that's in a safe place, right, within the environment. But again, it's built off of that idea. So again, a lot of those things, it can execute code, handle governance, and it has audit logs, and again, you can have human in the loop controls. All of those fun things are in there. And again, I hate to bring it in because I haven't talked about it yet, but again, with Work IQ, it's one of the things that will, over time, it will build context around using Work IQ and it will learn how you're working, right? Learn how you're doing things, and it can continue to kind of work on behalf of you within it. So again, pretty cool thing within that. And again, it's the autonomous side of it, which again, I think every customer on earth I've ever talked to this is kind of what they were looking for. I think some of the agents had filled some of that gap, right, but not fully, in my opinion, because again, they were still looking for inputs or triggers or things like that. And again, I think just the whole OpenClaw thing really kind of just blew the doors off of what a lot of people were looking for. And again, in my opinion, it kind of brought the AI timetable a little bit quicker than I think people were expecting, because I think this autonomous piece was always coming. It was on the roadmap, it was there, but then OpenClaw kind of came out of left field and everybody just latched onto it, and it was running businesses and doing all sorts of crazy stuff. So you see a lot of places have kind of, taken in that OpenClaw technology or open source technology around that and embraced it, because again, that's what the market was looking for, and that's exactly how they embraced that piece of it within there. So what are you guys' thoughts on kind of Scout?
I mean, I'm personally excited for it. I'm maybe cautiously excited because I think I've heard more of the horror stories about OpenClaw and some of the things that it did and shouldn't have done. That's where I think having some of the Entra integration, both with conditional access, as well as just app registrations and delegated application permissions, I think that's going to be huge. I think that changes the security landscape when we start talking about agents and what they can do autonomously. I think there's a handful of other standards coming out that also will be important from that perspective too. That I want to see how all that shakes out. The one thing I really don't like, and then I'll turn it back over to Sean, is the fact that Microsoft already has an autopilot. When we talk about end user computing and the deployment of machines, so not very happy about them reusing the same terminology. That's going to cause some wonderful confusion depending on who we're talking to. So anybody who is currently working on Windows 11 provisioning, go yell at Microsoft about it. There's a new autopilot in town apparently. But yeah, I mean, otherwise I'm super excited about it. I think it's going to change the way a lot of people work, myself included.
And that's exactly my confusion was when I heard all autopilot. I'm like, but wait, autopilot's already here. Like you're using that for deploying, right? Like, what do you mean autopilot is new? And again,
Yeah.
I was very confused when I heard that terminology used too.
Well, and for people that were already making heavy use of like Power Automate and things like that with standard triggers and automated triggers based on certain activities, it's kind of like taking that to the next level, in my opinion.
Sure. So since I talked about it a couple of times, I'll kind of pull it into the next piece. Is there's this idea of Microsoft IQ. So what is Microsoft IQ? It actually brings in Work IQ, Fabric IQ, Foundry IQ, and Web IQ. So I'll talk about a couple of those and then kind of kick it over to Sean to talk more about the Fabric IQ things. But the way of it is kind of I like to say, and maybe this is the wrong analogy, but it's like AI on top of data, right? That's the way I look at it. It's kind of a unified intelligence layer that sits on top of your data, right? And it's going to hook into your agents. Again, we just talked about Scout. It's going to run that. And again, if you think about Copilot today, if you think about like the Graph API, so the Graph API is what kind of, in my opinion, makes Copilot, right? It's aware of the things that I'm doing, right? And I would say that's more of I have to give it context of what I'm looking for, but it's aware of those things. So the example would be if I had a customer, right, and I have calendar items and I have stuff in SharePoint, stuff in my OneDrive, stuff in my email around customer, and if I say like, tell me about customer X, right, on that. Copilot's smart enough because of the Graph API to go across those things and pull those, but it's not really what I consider like an intelligence layer. It's really just kind of pulling that stuff, right, and listing it out. Well, you had a meeting last week, and here's kind of what was talked about. Where this is going to come in my opinion, right, is that this is going to be kind of a layer that sits on top of Graph, almost like AI sitting on top of Graph, and is intelligently context aware of a lot more than just kind of pulling this stuff from Graph, right? It has what I always love to say is the context layer that's going to sit on there. It's that going to, and then again, you feed that into your agents or Scout, and that is going to be, in my opinion, a lot of the personalization of your AI usage in M365 of that. It's not this generic thing. It's me. It's mine, right? It's yours. It's someone else's. It's that. So kind of the breakdown of these different ones is again, there's Work IQ. So this is kind of your M365, right? Organizational signals, right? Like I said, it's your email, it's your meetings, it's your files, people you talk to, calendar, chats, basically the understanding how people work, That's kind of work IQ, right, around that. Then we have Foundry IQ, which is basically aggregation of all of the IQ sources plus files, plus now we're talking MCP servers that we're going to pull in, right? So not is it just my work stuff. And again, I would consider all of that stuff work stuff, right? If you're connected to a database somewhere with an MCP server, but now this is all of that, right? It's not just my emails and my meetings. Now it's looking at this work data that's being pulled in, right, via that kind of the orchestration brain, if you will, of this. And then the next one is, I guess it falls into this, but not sure how it would necessarily fall into what I'm exactly saying. But the idea behind it is web IQ, right? So this is kind of now re-architecting, basically search and whatnot for agents, right? So this is kind of putting, as I've heard it, almost like a web MCP, so that it can, extract some things from the web, or again, if you're building those kind of web hooks internally around that, so that it can kind of pull, Bing type of things in there. So
Live internet grounding, essentially.
yeah, live internet grounding. Yeah. But again, if you're kind of building your site a certain way, you're almost help feeding the agents based off of the information that you're building within these sites. It is probably a good way to say
yeah,
it.
If you're putting together an agent that's going out against a public website for various sets of information, and that information is going to change regularly, then this is going to be a very helpful piece. To include.
So, Mike, would you we've had RAG obviously available in AI for a while now. This kind of seems like the next step past what we refer to as traditional RAG, right? Is that how you're seeing it, or how I'm seeing it?
Yes, it is. Yes, I would see it as how I would categorize it is RAG is something that I make an effort to train it a certain way. This is, to me, a layer on top of that, to where it's intelligently, without me, making decisions, and not decisions, like it's not going and executing, but it's making thoughts about my data, if you will. Like I said, it's kind of like an intelligence layer on top of your data. So like, it's like here's AI, here's your data, it's sitting in between, but it's also AI. So it's like AI talking to AI, if that makes sense.
Almost like an intelligence quotient or IQ.
Yes.
Very interesting. Yes.
So kind of rounding that off, Sean, what about the Fabric IQ side of that?
Yeah, that's the fourth factor of Microsoft IQ, the Fabric IQ. And what that's really designed to do is put together two very important concepts on top of your standard Fabric data platform. So we know that historically, and when I say historically, I mean going back just a couple of years, Fabric's still pretty new. But you have your data platform, you have your medallion architecture, you have one lake, you do all your ETL, you've got reports out there running in Power BI, semantic models, and all of that. That's kind of the classical workflow of data engineering process. But what Fabric IQ is trying to do is it's trying to do two things. One, you set up this concept called an ontology. And what an ontology is it's really an attempt to map your business through your data. So it's going to take your table structure that you have in the semantic model and the columns, and it's going to put relationships to those in a way that makes sense to the business, not necessarily in a way that you would do it if you're putting together a star schema. What does your dimension tables look like? It's more like, okay, you've got a set of sales here. Sales has customers. Customers have addresses. Customers have locations, things like that. And so you build out this entire map of your business process that can encompass multiple semantic models, multiple data sources. And with that ontology providing that business context on top of your data, then you can create more sophisticated data agents against that can do all kinds of different things, not just return information, but can actually perform various actions. Think of, notifying an account executive if something has changed with one of their accounts. So things like that. And that kind of gets into that autopilot realm too, because you can start thinking about how you might be able to use that type of an approach on the data side as well. So pretty interesting there. The other interesting piece about Fabric data agents is they're not just available inside of Fabric. they can be deployed outside of Fabric. They can be deployed to teams. They could be leveraged in other places throughout the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. So that's a very sort of interesting way to abstract away the whole access and usage of your Fabric environment to maybe specific users that you don't necessarily want poking around in there. So that's pretty cool too. And the other thing to mention about that is that ontologies are not GA yet, but I think that's coming soon, probably by the end of the summer. This is something that Microsoft's been talking about for like 6 months. And so, I think you're probably safe to start developing and playing around in that space right now without risk that it's just not going to happen. It's not a matter of if, it's more like when on this one, I think.
It makes sense. Now, from an ontological perspective, you were talking about things like, hey, I've got customers and customers have addresses and customers have contacts and contacts have emails and things like that. And just kind of building out that graph, like almost like Mike was talking about earlier in with the Microsoft graph.
Exactly.
You can span different data sources to kind of build out that ontology, right? So like
100%.
what you were talking about was traditionally what we would see in a CRM. It's like, okay, cool, I've already got those connections in my CRM, but you're talking about actually pulling other data and taking multiple data sources to build that out. Is that correct?
Yeah, for sure. And the way I like to think about data agents is when customers are looking at talking about, well, I just want to be able to interact with my reports using Copilot. And that's great. And a year ago, we thought that was the be all end all, is I want to be able to make natural language queries of my reports in Power BI. And that's kind of that end state, that end goal. But the challenge there is that chat session that you have inside of Copilot in Power BI only has that context of that given report or the semantic model underlying it. So you can certainly envision, business cases where you want to be asking more sophisticated questions of your data that involves other models, other pieces of data, maybe data that's coming from entirely other systems. And so that's where this data agents and ontology layer comes in, because it allows you to just make all of those complicated connections and still be able to use the power of, large language models and AI to be able to return results and give you, important information to make business decisions.
And that's all powered by OneLake, if memory serves. Is that correct?
Yeah, all the underlying data that you're going to be, OneLake is sort of that underlying data source for all that. Now, that's the other beauty too, is what we're seeing, and this wasn't necessarily mentioned in build, but the continued expansion of mirroring inside of Fabric makes that data ingestion exercise so much simpler than it used to be. So you can think of being able to bring in data from a whole variety of Azure data sources and sources outside of Azure, even things like Snowflake supports mirroring now. And so imagine bringing that right in by just setting up a few clicks. Now that data is available in OneLake. It's available for Copilot. It's available for data agents and ontologies, and really accelerates the time to value on putting together these types of solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike, anything to add on the IQ piece? I know you kind of kicked us off on this trail, but.
Yeah, no, nothing on the IQ piece. I'll talk a little bit later about some of the Microsoft's own AI models that they came out with, which I think is pretty interesting. I've used one of them for a couple months now, and it's pretty good, but we'll talk about that later.
And the one comment I'll make here too is, when Mike and I having these conversations with clients, we're often talking about two different data worlds in terms of how we're accessing AI and data. We're talking about file structured data. We're talking about data inside of Teams, emails, Microsoft 365, and then that structured data world that might live in Fabric is kind of different animal, and they're accessed by different copilots. But as we're seeing now with all of these IQs, I think those lines are going to be blurred, and it's not going to be too long before customers are starting to envision solutions that are combining things from both of those worlds into a single agent. So I think that's something to look out for here in the next 6 to 8 months. I think we'll be seeing a lot of that.
Yeah, I mean, from my side, we're starting to see a lot more of that just from an Azure perspective. Customers who are using Azure files for file storage and traditional file structures, customers who are using Azure NetApp files, maybe they're using SQL database or managed instance or PaaS instances. There's a lot of people are realizing that they have these capabilities in these locations they can store their data in, or they want to keep using it the way that they always have, and they just want to cloudify it, for lack of a better term.
Yeah,
is a better term for it. Or they want to do true modernization to say, well, let's get rid of some of these traditional data structures and move to something that's more akin to, like a DocDB, or moving from SQL to Postgres, which, Sean, I'll come back to you here in a second to talk a little bit about Horizon, which was a big announcement back at Ignite, and more information here at Build. But whenever I'm talking to our customers, and whenever you all drag me into conversations where you're talking to your customers about Azure, landing zones are always key. The structure and the security and the governance and the standardization of an environment becomes very, very important, especially as we start talking about, as Mike was mentioning earlier, now you have agents that can act on behalf of you. So having your RBAC in place, having your naming conventions in place, having everything else there is going to be paramount to making sure your data is secured. That's not even getting into things like Purview and DSPM, which we're also having so many conversations about. So I was very happy to see landing zones get a little bit of love at Build in two sort of major areas. So number one, the acknowledgement that there are new things that need to be taken into account. So agentic workloads and securing your agents and the access into them using things like Azure API Gateway and AI Gateway and stuff like that. That was a pretty big announcement. Microsoft actually providing guidance and what an AI-enabled landing zone looks like, what a data landing zone looks like, and sort of shoring up their recommendation and their reference architectures. And that just helps us and helps our customers make sure that they're aligning with Microsoft best practices when we start to come along with these conversations and securing those environments. So I was very happy to see landing zones, just because I think they're kind of the redhead stepchild. Sorry for any redhead stepchildren who are watching this webinar, but I feel like they don't get a lot of love. You guys know, and anybody who's talked to me know that they have a soft spot, or I have a soft spot in my heart for landing zones.
There's sort of that thorn in our side, like, okay, now if we want to propose this project, we have to do this thing first, and that's going to cost the client more money and more time. But the reality is it's going to probably save them money in the long term, because you're going to be building something correctly. You're not going to have to do rework, and it's going to reduce some of that risk too that is inherent in any of these types of projects we're putting together.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't mentioned at Build, but FinOps and cost optimization are huge when we talk about landing zones. So I'm not going to dive into that too much because it's a little bit out of scope for what we want to chat about here today. But absolutely love the fact that landing zones did, once again, we're called out specifically. And one of the other main components of landing zones that I was really happy to see finally get announced in preview right now is the resiliency manager. So essentially, when we start talking about making these agents available to your users, you want to make sure that they have minimal downtime. And things happen. Sometimes you make a change. Sometimes there's a Microsoft outage. Sometimes it's a combination of the two. Where Microsoft has started sort of moving things forward is, so they've had the Azure SRE agent for a while, so site recoverability engineering, to sort of do analysis and help you figure out why your environment's down. But now they actually have this resilience manager where it'll do an analysis of your environment and say, hey, here's a single point of failure for, that in this environment, in this workflow. Like maybe you're not replicating your database to another region. Maybe you've only got a single app service instance that's hosting your web interface. So the fact that you can actually go in there and get some really quick insights and really quick metrics on, where you have those single points of failure, I think was huge, and is once again core to our reliability pillar of the well-architected framework. The other thing that people always forget about is probably my favorite named Azure service, which is Azure Chaos Studio, which is how you can go in and simulate failures in your services and your resources. So now that's got some integration and resiliency manager, and that's going to be integrated even more going forward. But yeah, I think those were very, very good to see. There are a couple other Azure announcements that I'll get into here. I don't want to take up too much time, so because people just get bored of listening to me talk. But part of that, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, is going to be ACA sandboxes and how to run applications. But Sean, I'm going to turn it back over to you for a second, because if memory serves, Rayfin was also something that was announced and is huge.
Yeah, that was a huge announcement, and the Rayfin announcement was really, you can think of that as a new back end service for that agentic era, and what that is going to allow people to do is to build applications right in Fabric, deploy it right to Fabric with the Fabric back end right in OneLake. So I was trying that out just the other day, and with a few commands, you're able to spin up a brand new application that you can interact with. The data is going right to database tables here in Fabric. And, that's just with a few commands. You can certainly use AI in that context as well to build out fully featured applications there. And so, what the big benefit there is, you're getting all of that existing security structure and governance that is already established in your Fabric instance, and you have it already there. You don't have to build out separate APIs, separate layers like that. So that's a pretty cool announcement. That's in preview, but it's certainly out there to start playing with. I would encourage you to go look up some of the videos on that, look up some of the presentations from Build on Rayfin and Fabric apps, and start seeing how you might be able to leverage those in your own environments, because I think to me that's going to be a game changer for a lot of the things that we're doing. We see sort of that, up until now, what do we do when we have a certain need like that? Well, you got to build out your own other apps. That's going to be a power app somewhere, maybe for a lightweight app, or maybe you have an existing Azure environment and you want to be able to do something like that. But now you can think of this as a really easy way to be able to interact directly with data that you already were planning on bringing into Fabric.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the other major themes that I saw during Build, and you guys can keep me honest here, is Microsoft making it easier to sort of get access to your agents and your data, and to be able to interact with it, and to sort of make your life easier. So rather than having to go out and choose a model, or to spend a lot of time manually integrating MCP servers and data sources and things like that, it's like, okay, what can we do to lower the friction for people to be able to adopt agents in the workforce and overlay AI and things like that. I think everybody wants to do that, because it obviously drives adoption and things like that. But going back to you, Mike, I think one of the other things in that sort of vein, in reducing that friction, is agents and Foundry and agent service and things like that. Just because I think that does make life a little bit easier from that perspective. But I know that's a topic that you wanted to cover off on today too. So I'll turn it back turn it over to you if you want to.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things that I think a lot of folks don't realize with kind of the Foundry side of things is that you have options of models, right? And they don't have to be the big models. It doesn't have to be your OpenAIs. It doesn't have to be your Anthropics, right? I mean, there are open source ones that are in there. And again, I've talked to a lot of customers about this. Some are starting to see that, right? And one of the beautiful things about having that selection of being able to kind of pick your model is this stuff is going to add up over time if you get very agent heavy, right? So kind of the idea, or the quick math that I always do is, let's pretend that you decide that you want this agent to do whatever, read documents and do something, right? I wouldn't do an agent for that because it pretty much does that in Copilot, but work with me on this. So the idea behind it is almost everybody I talk to is like, I want to do that, the latest and greatest. I want to use the latest Opal, or Opus, or the latest Chat GPT when 5.6 comes out. I want it. But what they don't realize is, one, those have a very high token cost, right, to them. And if you go and dial it back to something earlier, right, you can get the exact same performance, because perhaps what you're doing is, again, just reading a document. You don't need the latest and greatest crazy model to do those things. You can go backwards in time, get that, and you can have major cost control behind it. And again, just I'm giving stupid numbers out. These don't make sense, but it's like if I went and built this agent that everybody uses in my organization in Foundry, but I'm using, the latest Anthropic model, that might cost me like $5,000 a month, right? Now, again, maybe it's not a big deal. It's one agent, but now if I get lots of agents, that $5,000 is a lot when you times it by lots of agents. But something as simple as a small tweak of just setting that backwards and maybe not using the latest Claude, maybe I go back to like a ChatGPT 4.0 for this. Well, now that might only cost me $50 a month, right? Because I'm going backwards in a model. And again, if I have lots of agents, again, I'm not saying every agent has to be built that way, but that's what I love about Foundry is, one, you have access to, it's over 11,000 different agents or models to choose from, but also just some of the templatization that's in there to get a voice demo up really quick, to get one where it's scanning receipts up really quick, or using cameras for vision. All of that stuff, Microsoft makes it really easy to kind of entry point to get in to start doing these things in a really quickly manner. So that's one of the things I absolutely love about it. One thing I want to touch on real quick is some of the new models that Microsoft came up with, right? So I think these are important because I think is an important kind of step that Microsoft is making. So again, spoiler alert, if you are unaware, Copilot has historically always run on ChatGPT. I'm sorry I ruined that for you if you didn't know that.
Wow.
It
Wow,
has.
man. Revelations
So
today. Holy
yeah, well, there's lots of folks that still don't know that. So yeah, so it has historically been kind of a reskinning, if you will, of ChatGPT. Microsoft, obviously, I don't want to get into the drama or whatnot of them and OpenAI and all that fun stuff, but
yeah, we only have 27 minutes left, so definitely don't get into
that. But Microsoft, with their kind of that separation, if you will, again, they're still going to use the models for a couple of years, I think the agreement is, but Microsoft kind of went on their own path and made 7 models. So you're probably thinking, well, cool, but they probably like trained them off of OpenAI models, and they did not. Right. So these are from scratch. No third-party models were used, from the ground up, and they have, again, they call them MAI models, which stands for Microsoft AI, but they have a thinking model, a code flash, an image one. Now that one I've used for a couple months. They have an image flash, a transcribe, a voice, and a voice flash. So what does this get you? Right. So a couple things is, again, your thinking is going to be your traditional kind of text, right now it's in private preview in Foundry right now, but again, you can see how this will expand over time, right, to other things. It matches, again, I take these benchmarks with a grain of salt, but any benchmark, not just this one, just anytime I hear like the new Claude, it scored this, I'm like, I want to use it and see how I use it, because that to me is how it really matches. But in benchmarks, this matches Claude Opus 4.6, right, in the SWE Benchmark Pro, this thinking model. So I mean that's a pretty heavy hitter, right? And this is Microsoft's own. The coding one, again, it's out now. It's rolling out now, so you'll see that in GitHub for Copilot and VS Code out there. So again, it's a coding agent. I haven't seen how that stacked up against anything else yet in any of the benchmarks. This next one I've actually personally used is the image gen. So I used that a couple months ago. I've been using it for like a lot of my LinkedIn posts. It surpasses Nano Banana 2, which again, if you're familiar with that is Google's flagship one. It is actually right now rolled out in PowerPoint. So if you've noticed that your PowerPoint images look a little bit better, it is most likely due to that. So that one is awesome. And then again, they have the Flash one. So it's an efficient variant of kind of the image gen around that image gen. And then they have again, a speech transcription one. So again, I think we can all see where this is going, where it can integrate into Teams and Copilot and GitHub and all that fun stuff within there. And then there is a speech one. So there's different ones, again, 15 languages right now, but obviously it's Microsoft, so that's just going to expand with time. And then they have kind of an efficient variant of that. So these are the 7 new models. Again, pretty much 2 of them you can play with today that are out there, the image gen and the coding ones. The other ones are either in some sort of preview state or whatnot. But again, really excited to see what these will become right over time, and how these will, especially being that these are kind of like what I would consider like Rev 1 out the door, right, for Microsoft. And they're already hitting these benchmarks, right? So I think that is pretty cool, in my opinion, on that. And then the last one I want to talk about is Project Solera. So this one's a little weird not weird to me, because this is something I've actually been talking about since 2017, is that the idea that AI is going to be part of a wearable, right? Whether those are glasses, whether it's a pin, whatever. This is the next, I've been saying this since 2017. This is the next thing. This is what comes next, is the wearable. So the idea behind this is Microsoft, what they called chip to cloud, right, platform. And it's agent first device. So you're not putting traditional apps on these devices. It is an agent. And the interesting thing is it's not running Windows. It is actually running Android, which is pretty interesting to see, right? Microsoft kind of take that approach with it. And it has what's called just-in-time UI, meaning I can ask it things and it will create UI. The agent will create on the fly, right? It will create interfaces, things like that, right, on the fly. The idea, and again, one that was kind of shown, was almost like a desk hub, right? But again, smart glasses, again, that's what I'm very bullish on. I think that is the thing within it. And again, combining AI with that is huge. So again, the idea, touchscreen, it can have mic, cameras, facial recognition, right? You can think of how this could go with meetings, or kind of a real world scenario, right, of a healthcare worker that has a wearable, right? And they could take a badge and then, scan patient QR code. It could record and transcribe the whole visit. It could log the visit, and it could start a prescription, right? All from a wearable. All of that can happen right within there. So
pretty much like Star Trek, then.
I was just going to say that. Yeah,
you got it. Yep. And like I said, this is the next thing. This is going to be the next thing in the next, I think, 2027 is really where you're going to see the wearables and AI just kind of merge, and it will be very mainstream. Again, you're still seeing this today with like the Meta glasses and things like that, but you're actually going to be able to see things within your lens, right, of things that you want. You'll be able to talk to AI. It will tell you things. And again, this is where being connected to your data is very important, right? That I can wear glasses or a wearable, a pin. I can ask questions about an account or a customer, or if I'm in manufacturing, right? Maybe this particular process or not, and it will tell and visually show me those things right there. So this is where it's going.
So that's a really interesting use case, and I find it not funny, haha, but the fact that you brought up like healthcare, which obviously here in the United States, HIPAA is kind of a big deal. If anybody here has ever worked in healthcare, then you know that for sure. One of the things that I also think I thought was interesting about that announcement and the wearable piece is Microsoft sort of doubling down also on sovereign AI. So one of the use cases they brought up was like, to your point, hey, I'm in a hospital, I've got to bring all this patient data in. A lot of hospitals are still gun shy about putting their patient data in the cloud because of HIPAA, which is a huge deal, obviously. So, one of the other announcements I wanted to make sure that we touched on was Foundry Local and Azure Local. The ability to essentially run your on-premises inference and AI models and have it essentially run out of your Azure cloud, even though it runs on your hardware. So for those of you that have already made the investment into on-premises GPUs, whether it's Blackwells or something else along those lines, you can essentially have that be a part of an Azure local cluster. And you can deploy models from Foundry down to your on-premises hardware and run everything there. There's no need to take that data and move it into Azure if you are concerned about that. And also as we get into wearables, as Mike said, access to that data is important. If your internet circuit goes down or you have high latency between you and that Foundry endpoint or wherever that data resides, this can help you make sure that you have that always on sort of low latent connection by hosting that data on premises. It's kind of a weird swing of the pendulum, as we had like, everybody's on premises and then it's everybody goes into the cloud. And now it's like, okay, maybe now we're going back on premises a little bit. But we are having a lot of those data sovereignty conversations just because people are concerned about where their data is being hosted, especially sensitive or semi-sensitive data. And that's across any industry. If you're in legal, worried about your case files, if obviously we've talked about healthcare already, manufacturing, any of your specifications or any of your IP, all these are things that people want to make sure are secured, and maybe they don't want them outside their four walls, but have an immense, crazy amount of impact on AI and being able to have AI index and utilize those sort of data points. So I was very happy to see, once again, Azure Local get a little bit of love too, especially as we're still in the throes of Broadcom being Broadcom, and a lot of our customers looking to shift away from VMware into a new hypervisor platform. So that's obviously top of mind as well, even though, once again, not an still build. One of the other things to keep in mind from an Azure Local perspective is that it's not just for running VMs and it's not just for running inference. You can run things like Kubernetes clusters, and you can do fractional GPUs. So there's a lot of functionality that you can take from the cloud and bring it back on-prem from that perspective. So I want to make sure that we covered off on that. For those that want to keep their stuff in the cloud, but once again, want to make their lives a little bit easier in terms of running models and running agents, being able to run managed compute in Foundry is also something that was, I think, announced, or at least was put in preview during build. Essentially, rather than having to run a Kubernetes cluster, having to run a VM scale center, having to run traditional virtual machines, you can just run dedicated compute for you in Foundry, just essentially by choosing a model and choosing what you want to throw at it. It makes life a lot easier. I talked a little bit about reducing friction earlier. I think this is one of the easiest ways to do that, from at least from my perspective as we're having these conversations. So once again, you don't have to worry about provisioning everything and grabbing Helm charts and doing your fractional GPUs and all the other stuff that was traditionally difficult when we were standing up a more AI-centric infrastructure. Not to mention pulling the data in, which, Sean's talked a lot about Fabric and how OneLake has made that a lot easier. But Sean, we also haven't heard from you in a minute, and I guess I feel kind of bad about that.
That's right.
But, as we start talking about data, obviously SharePoint and SharePoint Online are huge from an agentic perspective, and having that sort of integration. Anything you want to say on the SharePoint side? And, I told you I'd come back to Horizon. So let's talk about that.
Let's talk about both of those. First of all, on the SharePoint side, SharePoint's old in cloud terms. SharePoint Online's been around forever. People are using it, not using it. They have their various opinions on whether they like it or not like it. And all of that aside, what we're seeing from our customers is a pretty strong uptick in movement towards SharePoint for people that are still leveraging legacy on-prem file servers. And I think that is in large part being driven by AI and agents and all of the stuff that we've been talking about today. And, the realization that companies want to be able to start leveraging those tools against their data, and having it in a data store like SharePoint, document libraries is a really good place to start. So even though there isn't necessarily anything quite as fun and sexy with SharePoint, we are certainly seeing the importance there. There are some new AI announcements around being able to leverage the existing Copilot interfaces to spin up sites and do things like that. Just some of the rudimentary tasks that you were previously doing manually in SharePoint. So there's some new features around that. But yeah, I think that, the bigger highlight to me is that SharePoint's not dead. It's not going away. And it's potentially even more important now in the agentic world than it, seemed like it was ever going to be 5 years ago.
I was told like 20 years ago from all the notes guys that SharePoint was going away. That notes was going to beat it.
Yep.
Are you poking me on that one, Mike?
No, honestly, in my career, I've heard that. Like every time I was into SharePoint, the notes guy would be like, "This is going to be gone."
For those of you who don't know, I was a notes guy in my former life. I did about 20 years of notes work here. So yeah, I was one of those hardcore resistors to anything SharePoint. But even though Notes is still alive out there in some corners of the world, certainly it has not defeated SharePoint.
Yeah, ain't that the truth? And it's funny you mentioned that, SharePoint's a little old in the cloud world, but it's a little old in just the IT world in general. I think all of us had full heads of hair when SharePoint was first released. So it's definitely been out there for a minute.
Yeah.
The last thing you did mention Horizon. So
yeah.
I mean the announcement of Azure Horizon DB is now this fully cloud native, fully managed platform as a service Postgres database out there that is designed and optimized for AI and agentic workloads and high scale transactional applications, things like that, real-time analytics. So that's a pretty exciting announcement there. You're going to start seeing that as also being something that's going to support mirroring into Fabric and all of the goodness that we talked about earlier. So if you're somebody that has leverage or has experience in the Postgres world and is looking for an excuse to move things to the cloud, now you're there. I think we're going to also start seeing some early adopters of people that haven't been using Postgres before, but are now seeing some of the benefits and the way it is designed here in Azure for agents and the AI world.
Yeah, I mean, kind of dovetailing into that, the other thing that I wanted to cover off on as well are container app sandboxes. So you mentioned that Horizon is meant to provide massive scale and allow for the enablement of thousands and thousands of agents and things like that. The container app sandboxes is kind of the same thing, which I really appreciate. It's really meant to allow you to scale your agents really quickly in an untrusted environment, as long as you have trusted code to run. So, for example, if you have your own agent or your own model that you want to leverage, and you want to have it run a query, but you don't know that whoever's running that query is going to do things that they're supposed to do, you essentially use sandboxes to spin up literally a sandbox. And all it does is it's going to execute the query. It's going to return results, and then it's just going to die. It's not kept around. It doesn't have to be, persistent. It's literally just meant to run something and then leave, which I think is really cool. I think it adds that extra layer of security as we're talking about how to, prevent persistence within an environment for your malicious actors and things like that. Obviously, being an Azure service, it has a full integration with things like managed identities and other Azure resources. If you want to use those as data sources, if you want to have it reach out to the web, you can have it even go through your firewalls and stuff like that. There's some really interesting use cases for that. I mentioned already about running those isolated agents and then just having it die. But one of the other ones is that these containers and these agents are meant to have sub 1 second startup times. They're based on OCI, which is so open standard for imaging for these containers. And they're really meant to spin up quick and then spin down quick. And just like any other Azure service, you pay for what you use. But I think one of the interesting things that Microsoft brought up was actually around research. Is if you have these massive parallel tasks that can be run, you can spin up 500 containers that are all attacking 500 different aspects of this one research project, and then sort of return everything back to an orchestrator and then get you a result. I think that has some major implications on Microsoft Discovery, which Mike, I know you had a little bit of a blurb on that you may want to cover on, but I think the research side of AI, this lends itself really well to that, and I'm kind of excited. But Mike, what are you hearing on the discovery front?
Yeah. So again, if you're not familiar with Discovery, it's basically Microsoft's kind of AI platform for scientific research and R&D, right? So again, a lot of the other players have been in the space too, right? Google's DeepMind is deep into kind of scientific research. So is OpenAI with a lot of that, and I think Anthropic's just now starting to trickle into that a little bit. But kind of this is Microsoft's kind of dip into that, right? So really kind of looking at hardcore, models around, again, it's very specific around, scientific research and whatnot. I mean, I wouldn't go and use it to ask what my last 5 emails were, right? I mean, I suppose you could probably do that, but that would be beyond overkill. But the idea behind that is, it's science-based, or energy, life sciences, semiconductors, advanced manufacturing. Right now, again, Mayo Clinic has been using it, right, kind of in there to do that. So, yeah, I think this is the next thing. Again, it's in preview. There is an app on GitHub that you can kind of pull that down and check it out. But yeah, it's kind of meant for that piece of it to kind of feel like doing that. And kind of the quote I heard around it is, it feels like being Iron Man, but for chemistry, right? That you kind of have all of this stuff at your disposal, able to kind of do these things. So, and again, you hear I'm very bullish on obviously AI, but that's what I love about AI is it can take someone who might not know a whole lot about something, or maybe they are very good at that one thing, and it can just force multiply them as an individual, right, of what their capabilities are. And again, that's why I love it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the major trends that we've seen, not just coming out of Build, but just with our customers in general, is how can AI make our workers more efficient? How can they, make their lives easier? How can they save me, even if it's 30 or 60 minutes a day? I mean, that's additional productivity, and that's a value add. So I definitely appreciate it, and I think all of us here are pretty bullish on AI. I mean, there's a reason that it was the center of Build, and it's a reason it's the center of a lot of our conversations.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think you're alone in that. We've got a handful of minutes left here as a part of this webinar. Are there any final remaining topics that we haven't covered off on that you guys think are important? So Sean, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I've got 2 things here, and these are more just buttoning up some loose ends that we talked about earlier. Mike was talking about, the different models that are available inside of Copilot right now. And one thing I wanted to highlight there is that if you are in one of your Copilots in Copilot, just the Copilot app in PowerPoint, whatever, and you're not seeing other models, check with your administrator, because some of these models aren't enabled by default, and you have to go into the different administrator clients and be able to make sure that they're available for you. So that's one just caveat that I wanted to bring up. We recognize that in our own environment here recently. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about here is, as we were talking about cost and pricing of models, I think it's helpful to try to understand that as you're forecasting out your AI spend and your token usage when we start developing agents, what I always try to counsel clients is that, yeah, we are going to forecast that your agent spend is going to increase over time. But that should be recognized as a good thing, because that's meaning that you're getting value out of it, that it's something that people are using. And so then that question is, how do you make sure that what you're developing is an actual value add and not just a nice to have? But the idea being that, you should be seeking to spend more money on your token usage over time, because then that means that you're getting some of that time back and savings that you're able to repurpose into doing other things. So it kind of goes into that whole ROI calculation of, why we're doing this all to begin with.
Yeah, but within reason, I will say.
Within reason.
You don't want to go from $5 to $1 billion and spend a month, unless you have some really easy way to justify that.
100%. Yeah, you want to be saving money, and the idea that you can leverage lower cost agents to do the same job in certain cases is completely prudent. But what I just try to counsel clients around, like, yeah, you're not looking to make sure that this doesn't go up. You're just looking to make sure that it goes up in a smart way that is commensurate with the value you're getting out of it. Absolutely.
So that actually touches nicely on the last point I wanted to bring up, which is some hardware changes or hardware additions in Azure. So for those of you who aren't aware, Microsoft manufactures their own silicon. They're the Cobalt series of processors, and Microsoft just released the Cobalt 200s into Azure. They also released the new AMD Turin processors into Azure, both of which can be priced lower than their Intel counterparts. and in a lot of instances can actually be more efficient than running various CPUs, depending on how your threads and how your core counts are set up and stuff like that. If you're not familiar, you haven't used any Cobalt CPUs before, if you haven't used Microsoft's distro of Linux in Azure, make sure you take a look at those. They actually tend to be pretty interesting, and they definitely compete very well against very similar hardware. So definitely a good thing to take a look at, especially for those of you that are looking to optimize your cost on the Azure side. The other hardware piece I want to touch on, and then Mike, I'll have you give us a little the last word, since this is your bailiwick. But the other fun announcement from Microsoft at Build was the Majorana 2 chips. The one thing I'm following closely, and I hope a lot of other people are, is the impending intersection between AI and quantum computing, and how that's really gonna affect things, and being able to have long duration qubits, and being able to have scalable quantum computers, and how that's going to change things, and this entire conversation we're having on AI. So Microsoft being able to announce a brand new quantum chip in Majorana 2 was a pretty big announcement. They're aiming to have a fully scalable quantum computer by 2029, which I think is a very admirable goal for what it's worth. So I'm pretty excited about some of the new hardware stuff that's coming out too. And for me, obviously very excited from a quantum computing meets AI perspective. So with that, we've only got a couple minutes left. Mike, what do you got for us?
Nothing new to bring up, just wearables. Think about this, people. This is where it's going. Right now, you're typing to your AI. That's going to change. You're going to be listening, seeing, and talking to it. And again, it's going to become in different forms, whether it's glasses, pins, pennants, things on your desk. This is where it's going. Bullish on that.
Michael is bullish on wearables. All right.
Yeah.
I like that.
Star Trek generation is ahead of us.
Yep. The next Netrix Polo I get is going to have it built in,
woven into
Enterprise.
it. Yes, woven into it as a button.
Exactly. It's perfect.
Machine washable and everything.
Yes.
I love it. On that note, thank you everybody who joined us for this webinar, and everybody who's watching the recording afterwards. Hopefully you found some benefit and some new nuggets of information from Build. If you have any questions on anything we've talked about, or anything else regarding technology, AI, cloud, et cetera, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can always email info@netrixlc.com to get a hold of us. There's a contact form on our website. If you're an existing client, please reach out to your account executive and schedule some time with one or all of us. As you can figure out over the last hour, we all love talking about these things, and guiding our customers in the right direction. That's literally what we do here in the office of the CTO here at Netrix Global. So with that, thank you again, everybody. Mike and Sean, thank you both for joining me in this webinar today. And everybody have a great rest of your day.
Thanks,
everyone.
Have a good one.
Yep.